Hey everybody, and welcome back for the week 2 critique of Art Camp 3. If you are not in Art Camp 3 and watching this, hi to you too. This stream is public just because I kind of don't mind if people watch some of the critiques, but what I'll be doing today is going over a bunch of student work and doing some paint overs and talking about things that can be improved and worked on as we go forward. Now, everybody did some pretty sweet work this week, and this is actually kind of one of my favorite critiques to do because I find it really enlightening and helpful in a lot of ways. Because what we're going to look at today is all of your master studies and then the applied studies that go with that. And applied studies are something that I don't think enough people do. A lot of people do master studies, but then end up just doing copies and just do mindless copying. And something I harp on people all the time in art camp is to do a lot of thinking and to be present and aware and actually analyzing the stuff that you're doing and the decisions you're making. And applied studies are sort of where that all comes into play, because a lot of people can copy something without understanding anything at all. But it's very hard to do a good applied study without actually understanding what you're doing. So I find it pretty interesting. So I think it'll be fun. I'll be watching the chat on YouTube. So if you got any questions, go ahead and ask on there. I think you can tag me on there, which like highlights it on my thing. So that would help to make sure I actually see what you're asking. So yeah, I think that's about it. We're gonna dive straight in here. Screen share. And there we go. All right. And just make sure I got the chat set up so I can watch you guys and see what you're yelling about. All right, sweet. So we're gonna just dive in. So this is a good study. I think you've gotten a lot of what you're seeing here in the original. There's a lot of cool stuff happening, and I think you've pretty well nailed it. I think there could be maybe a little bit more saturation overall. The original artist, who I actually don't know, was pretty darn bold with a lot of their choices. Like the distant blue mountains are very, very blue. You just put that on top, and you can see you've got a little bit more saturation that you can push in there. So that might be nice to see. Same goes for the grass. They've got a lot of these really orangey tones, and that helps to kind of punch up this foreground. But overall, I think you did a good job with this. Now for the applied study, when you took this over here, there's a few things I'm seeing here that I think you might have missed out on as you sort of translated this. And the first one that pops out to me is actually the arranging of these shrubs in the foreground. You did something that a lot of people will do sort of instinctively without thinking when they're designing things, and they will design pairs of sort of two similar sized ones. Same goes for your trees back here. A lot of similar sized stuff, but when you look back at the piece you studied, you'll see they have a really nice variety of shapes and sizes and placements. They've got, a good grouping of threes and randomness and a lot of variety in the sizes. So that's something you should probably work to bring into your own piece here and have that variety going on so that it doesn't get too samey. That's something that can very easily be done in landscapes if you're not careful. Just a little something to think about. Also, I think your contrast might be a little bit both too low and too high when you're looking at the more distant mountains here. I think, for instance, these sort of mid-ground mountains could do with a bit more contrast, bringing in a little bit more brighter colors into there. There's a little bit more contrast in the piece you studied in that mid-ground, and it'd be nice to see that. And then I think for the distant stuff, something I really like about what you studied is that the contrast is really low, and you might be able to bring that down a little bit and still have a similar effect. Also, if you're going to do mountains like this, you're going to get a little different color temperature than what you're seeing there. What you're seeing over here in the piece you studied is kind of tree-covered hills from the looks of it, which are going to have a different way of behaving, because you got to keep in mind they're basically green mountains that are seen from far away. But if you're going to do rocky outcroppings, they're not going to have quite the same color tones. So it's something to think about as you're sort of translating this stuff. So maybe bring in some warmer tones to show that it's rock and it's not just green trees and stuff like that. Although it would be actually kind of nice to see maybe some trees going into a mountain like this. We'll get more into that as we sort of study mountains and for that transition stage. But overall, I think this looks really good. You did a good job of translating the stuff, even bringing in some of the compositional shapes of these overlapping rolling hills. So it was good. Right. This looks good. So original, then study, then the final. I think what I'm missing from the original that I'm not quite seeing in the study, and therefore not seeing in the final, is actually a fair bit of edge control. Because I think some of the strength of this original comes from the fact that the edges are very, very carefully considered. And with your study, even though it's almost bordering more on just a color study, it's missing out on some of that. Like for instance, the shapes of these waves here are very, very careful. He did a lot of work designing all these shapes and making sure that those edges are actually quite sharp, which isn't the way a lot of people would tend to paint water and tend to paint crashing waves and stuff. They would tend to use a little bit softer edges and to try to show some of the motion. But he's actually done a lot of hard edges kind of everywhere. And that might be something to try to get into your own piece as you're doing this. Sorry, my tablet has decided to magically die. Here we go. My computer's great. So maybe thinking about going back in here, and if you don't mind doing another pass on this, taking a closer look at some of his edge work, which I think is one of the more fascinating things about this piece. I think there's a lot of cool stuff happening in here with all these nice little edges. Excuse me. So that's something to think about just as far as the original to the master study goes. And then as you're getting into the applied study, you did a good job getting the colors overall. It sort of has the same sense that the other one does, but I think it's missing some of the depth that your study has. The depth isn't immediately obvious how he's achieving it. It's not quite as clear as some are. He's using a lot of chunky brushstrokes everywhere. He's using a lot of sharp edges everywhere, and actually a fair bit of contrast in a lot of places. But if you start to break things down, you start to see that he really is grouping his values. Like the distant mountains here, the values are actually quite tight, and same goes for the rocks over here. Whereas when you're doing your applied study, you're actually getting very, very contrasty back here and losing some of that tightness of the value groupings. So tone those down a bit to get a little bit more depth. And he's also pretty strong with his foreground here as a vital element to this composition. And so that's something else I might bring in to help you get a little bit more depth in here, I think is what you're missing. The other thing that I see is actually quite cool is transitions from dark to light. One thing we'll talk more about when it comes to achieving depth in paintings is the transition from light to dark to light to dark, going back into a landscape. You can kind of call it like value banding or something like that, but it's a very, very important principle. And so he was very intentional about including some really dark values here before some really light values here, more dark values to more light values, more dark values, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, going all the way back. It's very important. So as you're trying to design your own sort of depth, it's important to get that in there. So you can actually add some darker values into this, and then maybe even adding in some brighter values. And again, like I said, he was careful about these kind of sharp-edged waves, which I find kind of cool. And it's something that, as you're doing your applied study, I'd almost like to see you try to do some of your own designed shapes of these kind of crisp-edged waves. So I might actually even encourage you to use a brush that allows you to have sharper edges more easily, especially if you're studying an artist like this that has a lot of hard edges. Overall, I think this looks really good. It's just kind of a few little tweaks here and there. The clouds don't make a super bit of sense here. I'm not really getting a sense of the form here, whereas in your study, I do have a fairly good idea of where the light's hitting them, where the shadow side is, whereas these feel a little bit less cohesive. So just another little thing to think about going forward. But looking good. Right. These look good. So I got some value studies, got some applied studies, got even a full study. Looks good. I think I'm mainly going to focus on your color studies and the applied studies, because I think that's where I'm seeing you're missing a few things. Your value studies are pretty close to spot on. I think you could have had a brighter spot sort of here in the middle to get this pool of light effect that you're seeing in the original. I think you're missing a little bit of that, but that's kind of it. You could also, this is one case where the skies are quite dark, and I think your value study here could benefit from a darker sky. It helps this area to pop a bit more, which is the whole focus of the piece. So maybe a little bit of a darker sky. But mostly I just want to talk about your color studies right here. And there's a few things that I think are a little bit off. I think you're missing a lot of the bright oranges in this piece that make the original really, really sing. There's a lot of quite intense colors going on in here that he balances really well with the desaturated colors. There's a lot of intensity going on that allows this piece to really glow. It's one of the reasons I like it so much, and studied it myself because I find it really fascinating. So maybe bringing in some more saturated colors in here, some stronger oranges, stronger reds, because they really play off the cooler desaturated grays that are in the piece quite well. In fact, I think your blue sky here, which is obviously just still a yellow, might be getting a little bit too blue. I'd push that a little back towards gray and bring in some of these really bright tones that he's got in the sky. I think that will also help. Just little things like that can actually have a fair bit of effect on the relative contrast and the relative color of other parts of the piece. And then as it comes into the applied study, it sort of even goes further away from where you started, and the colors kind of dull out even more, and it doesn't really have a really light sense of light that I think the pieces you're studying do have. So if you kind of go back in and look at just how much contrast you could add to these areas to get these glowing colors, there's a fair bit of room for that. Don't be afraid of a little bit more contrast, that sense of light. The piece you're studying in your applied study is really, it's all about this light and getting a stronger sense of it. Just bringing in some stronger colors throughout the piece. Even in the shadow areas, you can see you've got some really strong saturated colors in those shadows that play off nicely with the deep dark grays and browns and other muted colors in there. So yeah, that's sort of the overall impression I've got. Your full master study here looks quite good. You did a good job analyzing a lot of the forms and stuff. It's looking solid. I think there's just sort of some of those basic principles of some of those colors that I think you're missing out on. I feel like there's, for instance, a bit more purpley colors in this piece. It would help the light here. It's also some of the contrast in the trees and some of that snow. There's a little bit more in there. Maybe even stronger yellows as well. I think you're a little too shy on some of your saturation. It doesn't have to be a lot. In fact, it often has a stronger impact if it's not. But if you consolidate those saturated tones, you get a pretty strong effect going on and a pretty luminous effect. You also notice that the tree here gets very, very red as it's blown out from the sky behind it. I think that's kind of an important capture as you're doing even a color study like this, because that's just one little thing that actually has a fairly big impact on achieving that glowing sense of light and that feel of backlit tree, which is something that again gets kind of lost as you go into your applied study. But if you just threw in a little bit of kind of bloom light, you'll get a stronger sense of this backlit. So just some little things with your colors that I think you're missing that last little punch of color that will make a pretty big difference actually on how pieces read, even at this early stage. So just some little thoughts here and there. Overall, really nicely done. But yeah, good stuff. All right, so this looks good. I like this. I think my initial impression, it's fine that the color study is a bit stylized because you're mainly focusing on studying the colors, and that's good. But one of the strengths of the original is the solid sense of form that it has. Even though the values are extremely muted here, he has a very good sense of the planes of these mountains, separating the shadow sides from the light sides. And that's one of the extremely strong things about this piece, is that he's able to have these really crisp, solid shapes that read incredibly easily. And it's fine if while you're doing the color study, you kind of miss out on that. The value study, you do want to make sure that you are getting that, that you're getting a strong sense of the forms of these things. Because as you go into the applied study, that's when it sort of falls apart and you really miss out on that. So I don't really get a strong sense of clear delineated forms within these things. Because you've got the right colors in there, but you don't have the sense of form. So if you go back in here and almost just draw in some different forms, you might be able to kind of chisel out these mountains and show what we're looking at here a little bit better. So we're obviously going to talk about mountains more and some of the shapes of mountains. But even now, you can start to look at it in these master studies and start to break down these clear delineated forms so that our mountains aren't quite as soft and squishy. We want much firmer, tangible mountains. Now, the other thing that I see is you're missing a bit of the sense of depth. There's actually quite a lot of depth that the original managed to get in this ground plane. Whereas when you're going into your own, you're sort of flattening things out. You're doing what a lot of people do when they start doing perspective, and that is they start to kind of tip the landscape down a bit. So you're looking more down at everything than you really should be, when in fact you're actually looking pretty far away at these distant things. Now, you realize when you think about a guy standing here and painting this scene, start to think about how far away is this grass here from him? Is it 5 feet in front of him? Is it 40 feet in front of him? It's probably a lot closer to the latter. It looks pretty darn far away. And that's the closest he's getting to this. Whereas if you look at yours, you're getting really, really close. But it doesn't have quite the right receding feel to it. This stuff would recede a lot more. So thinking about that perspective and thinking about the sort of camera lens you're looking at your landscape through is really important. So I would almost kind of flatten this stuff out a bit more and try to get that stronger sense of depth. And I think you'll be a bit happier with your perspective if you do that. Also, try to be careful about too much randomness in terms of the brushwork, because even though it might look at first glance like he's very random here, there's a lot of consideration of these forms to show a lot of structure and a lot of form again. Same goes for the color of the tree trunk. You did a good job with it there, but didn't quite translate the fact that it was a different color from the leaves, which actually helps it stand out a bit more. So I would say when you're doing your stuff to get away from too many texture brushes. I think they're causing you to slack off a little bit on paying attention to the edges. Yeah, a few things here and there, but they do look good. You did do a good job of seeing a lot of the colors going on in the original, which is a very subtle piece. It's got a lot of nice subtle color variety in there. I just think that as you translated it, you missed out on a lot of his really intense, cool forms that I think is what holds the piece together more than anything. So just a few thoughts. All right. So I don't have the original, so I can't obviously say based on the original, but I'll try to do my best based on what I'm assuming things are looking at. The first thing I'll say is no more texture brushes for you. You are not allowed to use texture brushes for at least the next 6 weeks of the course. When you get into the final, sure, we might be able to reconsider, but for the next 6 weeks of studies, you are not allowed to use texture brushes. You are hereby banned from texture brushes. I have to do that to people, otherwise they just get themselves into trouble. And the reason I'm saying that is that you're trying to do with texture brushes what I'm assuming the original has done with very careful planning and very careful shapes. And even though you're looking at a color study here, we do have to be aware that having this texture actually detracts from the sense of color, in that you're almost visually mixing a bit when you've got loose edges and careless edges like that texture brushes will actually give you. So do be careful of that. The other thing I'd say is that I'm assuming, again, based on what it looks like, that you've got way too many dark colors going on here. Assuming that there's not as much pure black as you're depicting here. You could obviously tell me I'm wrong, but it does seem like there's just too much dark colors, and especially scattered dark colors. You've got clearly what seems to be some lines going on here, and there's nothing wrong with working with lines to plan out a piece and sketch it out, but when you've got these scattered dark lines all over the place, it detracts from the colors that you're trying to see. And if your focus of a study is the color study, then having those dark lines in there is actually really throwing your eye off, and you're going to miss a fair bit of stuff by doing that. So do be careful with that, and no texture brushes at all. And yeah, but overall, you did a good job starting to see those colors. I think you just got yourself into a bit of a trouble there with relying too much on effects and too much on brush strokes, and not enough on really bare bones color studying and analyzing the color itself. Honestly, if you've just want to for another study, just use an 100% opacity round brush. And they're the most boring things ever. But if you want to learn how to do color, even if you've got all this nice soft glowing light here, is going to be the absolute best way for you to study the color, because you won't be able to rely on anything else. And will probably come out looking kind of terrible in some ways, because you're not going to have a pretty painting if you're painting with 100% opacity brush the whole time. But I promise you that it will actually help a lot as your studying of color goes. I'm not sure what the original looks like, but I'm going to guess that, for instance, the reflection on the lake here is not nearly as bright as you have it, or at least not as wide as you have it. There's going to be some way that it's going to tone down. It never happens that reflections are brighter than the thing they're reflecting. So if you've got this tiny little moon up here and then a massive reflection, it really doesn't read correctly. So if you've got a few bright spots, sure, but that much bright reflection doesn't tend to happen. You can stylize it sometimes, but I highly doubt it was that intense. So just a few thoughts there, but good work. Right, cool. All right, so obviously studying a bit more modern of a piece. The study looks pretty solid. You seem to have done a pretty good job of studying all the different elements of it. I think the thing that I'm seeing as you took it from that into the applied study is you're missing again the sense of form and perspective that the original has. Yes, it does have a lot of the colors to it, but it doesn't quite have the same sense of perspective, for one thing. This piece is very strong with the perspective. You can tell exactly where the horizon line is, and you can even see with the clouds that they are like in perspective, and even the rocks are in perspective, and this ground plane is in perspective, and this building is in perspective, and all that. Whereas when you get to your piece, I'm not sure at all where the horizon line is. For all I know, the horizon line could be up here, horizon line could be here. I can actually see it both ways. You've got some straight lines up here that indicate that maybe the horizon line is up here, but I can also see how you could put it down here. So that goes back to what I'll always tell people, to put down a perspective grid before you do anything, because it is a super, super common trap to fall into, to think that, oh yeah, I can just wing it and figure out the perspective later. You cannot wing it. You can never wing it. You can always, 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 always put a perspective grid down. Always, every single time. Even if you think you know perspective, you don't know perspective, because it even comes into play when you're working on these clouds. One of the strengths of this piece, the original, is that the clouds have a lot of form, and because of that, they're all in perspective. You can see these nice rounded forms, and he's chiseling them out with these light and dark shapes. Whereas when you're getting your piece, you're again relying on some loose brush strokes that aren't quite getting the same effect. Even when it comes to just doing the color study, you're also missing out on all the nice bright values that he's got in his shadow plane, because you went through and put in all the bright tones, but you're not quite getting the sense of form of having these shadow sides to the rocks. And obviously rocks are, I guess, the next thing we'll be focusing on. So I would encourage you to do some serious rock studies so you get this sense of form and depth here. Because right now you've kind of done the rim lighting effect, where you've rim lit something effectively, but haven't done the work to chisel out actually in perspective forms that are making a lot of sense, if you will. So just kind of looking at these rocks and thinking about, all right, just kind of drawing some planes and chiseling out some shadow planes and some bright planes, and breaking it up from just thinking about, okay, I'm going to put some bright colors here and hope that it's more or less a rock shape. Rather than do that, really carefully go in and decide, like, okay, I'm going to have shadow plane here that's going this way, bright plane here that's the top of these rocks. Try to do it that way. Also, if the horizon line is here, the light's coming from here, you're not going to be able to see the top of the rock here in light. The top of the rock is going to be obscured from your vision, going to be shadowed, even if the light is coming straight from above. So definitely do a bunch of rock studies as we get into this coming week, and focus a lot on making sure that your perspective is spot on and figuring out where exactly you're looking at all the different objects from, and thinking about really basic shapes as far as how to draw them. Really, rocks are if you put, a basic perspective cube in there, you can have a much better idea of the shadow planes, the light planes, and how to convey that form in correct perspective. And I think that's something that will benefit you a lot. But looking good. I like what you've done with the colors. You did a good job analyzing those. Just as you go into the applied study, just a few things to think about. All right. So this looks good. I think. There's a few things here that I want to talk about. You've done a good job with this. The thing is the original is very simple, and that's fine. But it's something to recognize that if you're trying to make something interesting on its own, you've got to. If you've only got a few tools to make something interesting, you have to make the most of them. So the original piece is very, very, very simple. It's all about the effect of this light glow on the horizon and then the shapes of these rocks, which are pretty wild and weird. So as you're doing your applied study, that's kind of what you're trying to get in there. Because as it stands, the piece doesn't have a lot of interest. It's sort of missing that. I would say one thing, the water is a bit too bright. I think is distracting from what you're trying to do here. One of the main things, because that's what's killing the sense of glow on the horizon here. Water should tend to be a bit darker than the sky, by at least a little bit. And this guy's horizon is very, very bright. I like that about the piece. It's even brighter than the clouds up above, which I think actually works quite well. And I might like to see you try that out. Maybe darken down these things. And then pay a lot more attention to the shapes of these rocks. A lot of the work and a lot of the detail went into the shapes of these rocks. Since you're getting a little too pointy here, where it loses its believability, because things don't tend to get that sharp in nature without snapping off. So just some very simple things, but just a few important things to think about. I'm pretty sure the bright outline around the objects that you're painting into your piece are not actually in the original as much as it looks like they are. I'm having a feeling that that's just the reflections from some of the painting layers. I could be dead wrong about that. It's not a great reproduction of the piece, and it's really hard to tell, but I'm guessing these bright outlines that you observed around here are not actually there in the original as much as possible. Also, I do wonder about the reproduction and the fact that these darks get really dark and dead. Yes, some landscape painters do that, but I have a feeling that there would be just a bit more contrast in here. Again, not sure about that. This also could be a plein air piece where they're not quite as finished. It's kind of hard to say, but yeah, overall looking good. I'm not overly crazy about the original, which I think is part of my problem, but to each their own. I'm not going to judge you for the pieces you study. Just study pieces that you think look good. That's a personal decision. All right, looks good. Did a good job with studying the colors. Yeah, the colors are quite good. And colors work actually fairly well in your applied study too. I think the problem with what you're doing here is the same that a lot of other people have been having, in that as you start to go from the original to your sort of applied study, you miss out on the sense of perspective and form that the original is getting. Your perspective is pretty weak here. I definitely have a sense of where the horizon line is. You know, it's somewhere around here ish. But I have a feeling that it's just almost a little too fisheye for what it's trying to convey. The thing I love about this original is the strong, strong sense of perspective. You know, these things feel huge because of the context they're placed in and because of the strong sense of perspective of this receding off into here, these clear light and dark planes. Whereas when I'm getting into your piece here, I don't have quite that strong sense of perspective. And I wonder if just a little bit of time spent clarifying the perspective, making sure we know, we're looking up at these things and not down at them. Because, okay, so if your horizon line is here, yes, we have an indication of that with the architecture you've built in here, but the rocks and the ground don't have a lot of indication of that perspective. So I'm not sure where I'm looking down at something, where I'm looking up at something. And you can start to put those indications in even the rock forms that you're conveying. Even rocks can form the perspective. So start to think about these rocks more as shapes and less as rocks. Really think about that strong perspective of, okay, this is light plane, this is the dark plane, and these are going to conform to perspective just as much as anything else in my painting is. And even as you just start to do that, he starts to solidify a bit more. I also think that maybe the ground planes don't quite work. I think the ground would actually be, horizon line would be somewhere closer to there. And then I think it's tilting up a bit too much. So you're getting kind of shallow depth because of that. Also, the other strength I think I see of this piece is a lot of effort consolidating light. They did a lot of work to make this spot shine, and then everything else sort of recede and fade and be much more subtle. So I think it might be worthwhile to think about how you can do sort of the same, maybe consolidate the light and draw our eye in one particular spot rather than sort of dividing our attention in all of these light spots spread out all over the piece. Maybe you throw all of this into shadow. And maybe this little rock down here become your focal point. Right. So hopefully this is sort of starting to make a little bit of sense of what I'm trying to get at as far as translating the original into something a bit more powerful, I guess. That is what I like about this piece, is that powerful sense of both light and form. So bring more lights into your shadows here. They're getting pretty far away. Shadows can be brightened up a bit. And to help with the depth, the value range back here, for instance, is very tight. It's a bunch of shades of blue. And it'd be good to see some more of that, even as close as, here. I'm removing some of those red tones and focusing more on those cool blue tones. So, don't want to get too carried away with changing things here, but just trying to get that stronger sense of lighting, and also bringing back in these cool tones onto your shadow sides. By emphasizing the cool tones here, it lets the warm light from the main light source really pop. And just to answer the question, yes, there would have to be something blocking the light here. The old landscape painting trick of that is either A, mountain blocking it, or B, a cloud blocking it. It's amazing how often clouds or mountains can block anything, and trust me, they will. So here, yes, this is probably partially observed, but maybe he did it from different times of day to emphasize, there's a shadow right behind this pinnacle here. Maybe, in reality, at that time of day, for all we know, the light's actually like that. But the original artist might have been, well, I don't really want to paint like that. I'd like to have the shadow go behind it. So you can do these little changes and adjustments that can make your focal point stand out. You don't have to strictly follow reality as you're working on these. So, but looking good. So a little bit more emphasis on focusing the eye, on working on your perspective, and working on making sure those forms are solidified. All right. So we've got some good studies here. I really like the master studies you've done over here. They're really, really strong. I think the problem that you're running into is something a lot of people are, and that is edge control. And edge control as a detriment to your learning experience here. Because the fact that you had so many soft edges in this piece when compared with the original is part of the reason you're struggling to translate it into an applied study. Because in this piece, you've got some really actually quite hard edges, even on the light side, which you've observed in your value study, but as you've gone into your color study here, you've lost that. And you've actually got really crisp edges. This is sort of the school of landscape painting that tends to have crisp edges everywhere, which is fine. Obviously, a lot of great landscape painters did that, but all of their silhouettes are basically all crisp, and you've missed out on some of that sense of form. And that's part of the reason these are kind of falling apart a little bit, is that the value relationships here between your shadows and your lights aren't quite right. And part of that is the fact that the sky probably needs to be brighter in relation to your lit rock forms, as well as the lit rock forms probably need to be a little bit darker to look like they're part of the same form as your shadow planes here. Right now, they're so far divided in terms of values that it just doesn't quite make sense. you actually bring these just a bit darker, I think this will come together a little bit more. The other thing I'm seeing is that there's a lot more detail in the shadows than you were observing in your color study. And that's part of the way that the original is actually conveying a lot of the form, is having some of this indication of form in the shadows. Even though the value range is very tight, they are sort of showing us a sense of the planes and the perspective, and some cracks in the rock here, and there's a lot of information there in the shadows. Again, this is a case where perspective becomes hugely important, because anything you can indicate, anywhere you can indicate exactly how these rocks are receding and the form works is really important. You can't just like wing it with shapes and hope that the form reads. The form is probably not going to read if you try to wing it. Whereas if you go in there and closely observe things and pay attention to things, you're going to have a much stronger sense of form. It's also, when you did the water, you just kind of did the bright colors of the water without paying attention to the fact that there's a lot of reflection going on in this water that's making it read as water. So just a few thoughts there as you are studying this piece. These color studies are quite successful over here. I like what you've done with these. They're looking pretty good. You did a much better job with your edge work and edge control there that I think works much better. Yeah, so just a few thoughts here and there, but looking good. Right. This looks good. Good job observing the colors. I think those work really well. Let's see here. Just a few things. I think as you were translating the sky, you made it too blue, which is kind of throwing off your color palette a bit. Even though this looks rather blue, I think that's mostly coming from the relative color going on. I think this is actually quite a bit more yellow, kind of gray, just giving this afternoon golden hour lighting effect. Whereas your blue is just tilting things a little too saturated, and something that you might want to pay attention to. I think it's one of the more powerful parts of this piece. And then that sort of translates down into when you're doing your own, that you kept that slightly too blue form, and out on that. The other thing I would say that the original does quite well that you want to pay very close attention to is that even though, yes, at first glance, this looks very loose and chunky brushstrokes and hardly saying anything with the work, they're very careful with the few brushstrokes that they are putting down, that the few brushstrokes are conveying form. Whereas, obviously, when you're doing your color study, you're missing some of that. Also, the lighting, either the lighting or the perspective isn't making a ton of sense, because right now you've got a form that is sort of like this with the light plane here, which is making me think that the lighting is coming from this way, but it's obviously not based on this form. this side almost looks like it's coming in from this direction. And if it's coming in from this direction, then this form would be lit on this side. So your lighting is a little bit mixed up there in a way. Something to think about there. The lighting that you've observed is almost like the front lighting that we'll talk about when we discuss different lighting setups and landscapes. But you're getting a little bit off there. But anyways, going back to what I'm saying about the forms, they're very careful about showing, even though they've only got a few brush strokes, showing us the roundness of this mountaintop, for instance, and using these just very subtle edges, you know, soft on one side, hard on the other, to get that overlapping form. So it's possible to imply quite a lot with very little. Like I really like this little spot right here. It's super cool because it's this nice little light shape coming into this, got a nice dark shape, and then this beautiful like light brush stroke that actually says so much in that little spot. You get a sense of where the light's coming from, you get a sense of the roundness of these forms in a very little area. And that's something, if you want to push something like this study further, you could definitely think about. Because even though it's these chunky brush strokes that you think are just like haphazardly slapped on there to show the color, there's a lot of sense of form and roundness to these things that you get from the very delicate edge transitions. Yeah, I think that's about all I've got to say on that one. But looking good. I like what you've done here. Right. Good. Nice work with the study. The colors look pretty good. Forms look pretty good. I think there's a little bit more orangey red in a few spots, especially over here. There's a little bit more over there, but again, that's kind of nitpicky. I think the main thing I want to talk about is actually your translation into the study here, the applied study. One of the strengths of this piece is the almost countering of the forces in the composition. That is, when you've got these strong sweeping lines, there's almost always something counteracting that in a different direction. So you've got, for instance, these strong lines here that are very obvious, but he's also got strong lines here to counteract those. And he's got this strong sweeping around form here that are all just intensely sweeping this way. But he also counteracts that by doing these strong sweeping forms this way, which creates a lot of dynamism and makes sure that it doesn't get too loopy like this. All the forms in your piece are sort of going the same sort of round direction. And this is almost getting close to what I talk about when I go into the common pitfalls of landscapes, and that people tend to do this rounding out of their forms towards the center. You see it a lot, and it's a common trap to fall into. So as you're designing this stuff, think about having some forms that are going the other direction, that are going against your common flow to this piece. Think about something that is completely breaking this sense of flow, going the other way. You know, if you've got loops going this way, and think about having some stuff going the other direction and breaking up that. Also, I have issues with people that frame their pictures too much, and I really personally don't. I don't tend to think it looks good Framing can work, obviously, but very rarely works as well as people think. So again, even though I'm going to have, a sweep this way and a sweep this way, I'm going to try to overlap them and do more of like cross section there rather than having a continuous U shape. Which is not to say you can't do those things. It's just they don't tend to look as good, and it's certainly not the strength of what you've got here. Furthermore, I think the perspective is also throwing you off here in that your sort of ground plane just kind of leads up here and doesn't have a believable sense of perspective to it. It all just sort of warps up there. I don't have a sense of the receding plane here. All right. A little bit closer to what I've got in mind here. The other thing I like about the original that I think is very successful is he's very, very careful about where he's putting his lights and designing these spots of light and right where he's going to put them and making sure they're well contrasted against nice dark forms. And that's something to think about, that maybe if you're going to have this light loop on this side, maybe actually put some shadowed stuff on the other side. So I don't want to go too much further than that. I changed more than I tend to. But yeah, so good study and just a few things to think about as you're doing your applied studies. I will say that you did a good job with making sure you had perspective on your clouds, which makes me very happy. So keep doing that. All right, sweet. We got some actual original stuff. We got some oil painting here. So that's cool to see. So let's see here. On these, I like what you're doing with the colors in these. You did a good job with that. I think part of the struggle is, I think a lot of it's coming down to the edge work again, and that's partially the nature of oils. And also, I think you're getting a little too thick with your oils too early in an effort to get the right colors, which is causing things to blend and making it a bit more difficult to layer on the chunky stuff at the end. It also could be partially that you just need to do more coats on these. Unfortunately, it's kind of unavoidable with oils. Doing them purely a la prima at this scale is very hard. When you look at nice plein air work, it tends to be a little bit bigger than this, or they tend to be in mediums that allow layering a bit more easily. If you look at Nathan Folks and his studies, he does them fairly quickly, obviously, in one sitting, but he's working in mediums that allow him to layer more easily, which allow him to do the nice edge work and stuff that you see in those. And that can obviously be quite a lot harder when you're working in oils like this. But these are looking good. You've done a quite good job of getting the colors in there for such a broad range of colors. You've done a very good job. I just think that in some of your, for instance, dark areas, the darks are missing a bit of the luminosity I'm pretty sure the original has. They're getting a little kind of chalky, grayish, dark, just kind of generic dark, dark browns, dark grays, rather than having the full color that I think they have. You've done a good job with the colors in the light areas, but in the dark areas, they're getting just a bit too muddy. That could be simply a case of cleaning your brush more as you apply those dark tones, or maybe applying the dark tones a bit earlier on. Yeah, I think a lot of it does come down to just using the paint a little too thickly on the first coat, which means you have to really kind of slap it on there on the second coat. So I would say maybe on that first pass to be a little bit more delicate and thin with those colors so that you don't have to go quite as intense on that second pass. But looking good, and good job with getting those colors in there, even in traditional media. It's something I'd like to do a demo of at some point. I've got a bunch of old sketchbooks full of color studies that I did back in the day of masters, and it'd be good to go back and do some of those. I used to do them in all different mediums, oils, acrylics, squash, watercolor, just about anything I could get, and be kind of good to go show those again. But looking good. Keep this up. All right, this looks good. Really like what you've done with the study. You've done a good job showing that study. There's a few things that I think you're getting off on here. For one thing, you've got too much contrast in a lot of areas. You're thinking about things a little bit too much. You're looking too closely at things, which is causing you to think there's more contrast than there is. This is a very subtle piece, and most of the contrasts are very subtle. And you've gone a bit overboard with some of the contrasts in a lot of the areas. So this hill, for instance, in the original is very faded back in there. It's very gentle contrasts. And same goes for these hills. You don't even really see them. They all group together quite nicely. And even the darks down in here in the water are going to stay very gray and light and low contrast, much lower contrast. Even getting back in here, the contrast is often a bit less intense. And then even in the foreground, again, you're very gentle with making sure that he's focusing his lights a lot. So as you're going from that into your applied study, you're missing out on a lot of the design work that he did to make that piece so successful. For one thing, you can see that he spent a lot of time making sure that the reflection and the bright spot on this water behind these figures, he's really silhouetting them nicely. Whereas yours, the silhouettes are not quite as clear because you haven't gone through the trouble of making sure that that's the spot that you really want to make stand out. So if you're more conscious of what's important about your piece and where you want your contrast, when you've got this ethereal lighting, you can do kind of anything you want. And if you just want to focus in your contrast in one particular area, you can do that. Nothing saying you can't. Maybe that means you tone down some of these other areas. Also be careful getting lines in your backgrounds. There's nothing wrong with lines again, but if you don't incorporate them appropriately, they can throw off your colors and your forms, particularly if you're thickly outlining distant mountains and stuff. They can flatten out a piece very quickly. I'm just doing some general softening and getting rid of some of the lines that I think are, the fact that this foreground was outlined means that you were trying to separate those forms based on lines rather than colors and shapes. Again, designing things to make sure they read. If you want to have this cliff up there and have some bright edges on the edge of it, you can always put some of these dark, icebergs right behind it to make that edge read a bit better. And also, by adding in more of these objects, you get a stronger sense of perspective leading back. I think will help this piece read a bit better. I'm just kind of lowering the contrast in a lot of areas, making sure this piece is focused, because that's one of the strongest things about the piece you're studying. So making sure you get sight of the strengths, rather than just the landscape itself, which is this cold, barren landscape. You also really get what the artist did best in the piece, which is getting this very soft, ethereal glow and a lot of focus. A few thoughts there, but I think helps the piece a fair bit and make it a lot stronger. So think about going forward. Yeah, overall, really nice work. Just a few tweaks here and there to focus and refine things. Right, this look good. So good color study, good value study. I'm not seeing, I think, enough influence of the piece you studied in the applied study. You've studied a piece that's about mountains, and you've kind of tried to make it about water. And the water is decently successful, but it doesn't quite translate the skills you've been learning into the piece. This piece would make a lot more sense if you had more mountains in it, whereas you've got a tiny little glimpse of them here and some in the foreground here, but the original doesn't have any of that stuff. Furthermore, I think one of the strengths of this piece is the shapes that the clouds are making. They're making these cool shadow shapes that are chiseling out these mountains and causing this form to change. Whereas here you've got kind of this flat overhead lighting, and you're not utilizing all the cool stuff happening here. Even looking at the rocks and the coastline, you're sort of doing these kind of random wavy and a little bit of rocks, but you're not getting the strong sense of form here because you're not analyzing the fact that, okay, when you're looking at these pieces, there's very low contrast, and the way the artist is implying form is actually just with a few really dark strokes on the underside of the forms, with a few chunky brush strokes. Same goes for in the trees. They're making them have a lot of depth and form by looking at just a few dark spots. And just adding in a few dark spots to even your piece, you can start to see how, all of a sudden the value range is way bigger, and they've got a a lot more form going on. So just as you're doing your applied studies, start to think more about that and making sure you're translating the right stuff as you translate this stuff. Furthermore, you don't even have the snow. I mean, come on, snow is the best part about this piece. Snow is fantastic fun, and it's so easy to make focal points out of. Start to throw some snow in here. Snow's a blast. So paint some snow. Looking good. Colors are good, and the study overall is quite good. I would maybe chisel in a little bit more of the form. I know this is just a color study, but just a few edges around the focal points to get in the form, I think would help a lot. I think that's about it. Overall, really nicely done. I think today's word is definitely form. That's something I harp on people so much. It's just really important. All right. So Richard Schmid is awesome, obviously. So good artist to study. The thing that you seem to be missing, and the thing that Richard Schmid in particular does very well, is he does tend to prefer these really muted overhead lighting schemes where almost the entire piece is one value, and it's just modulations of color and hue and saturation and all that. The thing he does really well is that he's got a few punches of very strong darks. And that's the one thing that didn't quite make it into your piece. And that's the reason they don't read nearly as well as his. The thing he does incredibly well is focusing these extreme darks in just a few spots to make the whole piece suddenly pop and read. So if you just go back in here and just add these, 18 brushstrokes of really well planned out darks, all of a sudden you're going to get way closer to what he has, because the rest is pretty well studied. You've done a pretty good job of looking at his colors, looking at the values, but going back in here, he does this tree by just mainly focusing on two dark tones where you do see the tree trunk, but the rest of it holds together very tightly. Oops. Richard Schmid does a great job of using darks as effectively highlights. By being so careful and selective with them, he gets to say a whole lot with very little. Same goes for some of his bright highlights, of course. He's very careful about where he's putting those, and therefore the whole piece just reads way better. And so as you're going into your applied studies, you're also missing out on those extreme hits of dark. And I think that's what makes his pieces so successful, is these extreme darks. But if you just kind of go back in and study a little bit better, you'll have a much easier time going into the applied studies, because all of a sudden everything's going to read much better. So it's a very tricky way to paint, and it works for him. But it is worth studying, worth learning from, and so you're off to a good start here. Just one little trick there, especially for this artist in particular. It's something to definitely steal from him. He's very good at it. All right, so these look good. So we've got a number of value studies, color studies, and applied studies, and what looks like a full study. This is really nicely done. Good Hopper study. I feel like maybe the contrast would be a little bit brighter. I have a feeling your reproduction is maybe a touch dark. I find it odd that the brightest colors would be this dark. I know he can be fairly muted with things, but I might look at other reproductions and see if maybe some of them are a little brighter. This is looking good though. I think the thing, I'm assuming the ones on the left are master studies and these are the applied studies. Part of your problem I think I'm seeing is that you're overly simplifying forms and missing out on some of the fun stuff that the original has. For instance, making the interesting overlaps of having this one in the foreground that is actually kind of breaking the sky and breaking the silhouette of the ones behind it. So you could throw a mountain here and actually put it in front of some of the stuff behind it. And it's got this nice cast shadow, and it's some of my favorite stuff about the piece you're studying. And might be kind of nice to see. Same goes for this one here. I'm not getting as strong of a sense of really solid form and perspective in your applied study. I think you're overly simplifying some of the mountain shapes, and I'd like to see maybe a bit more thought of having some different layers of different types of rock. What is the original artist doing here that is working so well? Rather than having these mountains kind of going straight into the lake, you can see how, yes, there's mountains, but there's also the fact that the forms and landscape are changing as they get further down, which kind of reveals a little bit more about what the mountains are like. So a little bit more overlap, which provides some more depth and also a bit more scale to these mountains. These feel a lot bigger than these do, which is actually pretty important. Same goes for the very edge of all the silhouettes. So for instance, this mountaintop versus this mountaintop, I get a lot of sense of form here, and then it kind of flattens out here. So it's even just these kind of focal point areas that help us to read the whole mountain, even though, of course, it's a fairly quick color study that you've done of the master. A little bit of attention at the top is all we really need to understand that mountain. So just a little something to think about there. Overall, quite nice. I like the value studies. Those are quite strong. Yeah, looking good. So this seems to be a popular piece for good reason. It's a fantastic piece. Actually, kind of want to focus on. A bit of both. I think one thing is that with this value study, I'm not sure if you're seeing the values quite right. At least I'm not getting a sense that the whole bottom half of this painting is quite bright, and then this feels like darks or midtones, whereas this sort of all goes to midtone. So I wonder if this could actually be a bit brighter, help to read better. They've quite stylized the sky and darkened it to get that bright blue effect, which works there. Overall, quite nice though. I'd like to see maybe a little bit more bold choices with mixing up the study, because basically your applied study, you've more or less flipped the painting, and it'd be nice to see, trying out different composition to a bit stronger degree. Same goes for this one. You've kind of more or less just flipped the painting and done a few things differently. So maybe mixing it up a bit more as you're doing your applied study. What's the other thing I'm thinking here? I think you're a little too tentative maybe with some of your lights. I think there could be some brighter values in here, because I'm not getting a strong enough sense of light in your study that I'm seeing in the original. So that's a mix of not going bright enough and not going dark enough in the right spots, particularly where the light meets the dark. Right at that point, you can have a bit more contrast in there and get those brighter colors, brighter values. And then as you go into your applied study, you really start to kind of dull things down. The values for this don't read nearly as well as they do here, because sort of how you've dulled things out a little bit here, it's gone even further as you've gone into the applied study. And so you have a much, much larger range of values that you can be using here in your applied sketch that I think you're missing out on. Also, I think just like the other person I did the critique of, I'd like to see some more contrasting angles of forms. So this sort of is swooping off a bit too much, and I'd like to see some angles that are sort of defying that. All right. So, playing a little bit with the lights and darks here, seeing what we can do. Get a stronger sense of light here. I think you're missing some of the nice saturation in the shadows here. Something you get, especially with these kind of red rocks and strong lighting out west, is you get these really bright reflected lights where the shadows really fill in with all this nice reddish, orangish light. And it's so nice to see. And you've got it here in the original. And it'd be nice to see some more of that. That's one of the other things that can help to get the stronger sense of light in a piece, is making sure that the reflected light is correctly observed. And then your eye sort of fills in the fact that for that sort of reflected light, you need a very bright light source. So if you look at my buddy, Victor Adame Minguet, magic artist, he does a really good job with reflected light and pushing it to the absolute extreme of almost unbelievable reflected light. But because of that, his sense of light in his pieces is very strong. So something to think about there. But overall, nicely done. Good observation. Right. This looks good. Yeah, I like this. There's a few things I'm seeing that aren't working super well. You've done a good job with the color study for the most part. The thing that I think is missing is the fact that this warmth here that you're observing is coming from the mist and spray that's along the edge of this water. So there's a few spots where you can see that kind of coming into play. There's some really bright contrasts here along the water. It's helping to bring the value range to where it needs to be, because everything's very muted. You need to have a few spots that are really bright and really dark to make sure it looks like it's using the full value range rather than just kind of missing out on it. I also think there's a little bit more kind of orangey glow to the water here, especially near the coast where this light is hitting. And then that sort of comes into play when you're doing your applied study, because you've got this warm glow to the bottom of these hillsides here, and then it just doesn't really make sense because you don't have any sense of this kind of warm mist here as the light's hitting it. But you do have this warmth here, which looks good, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Furthermore, you've got these mountains back here that are just kind of defying perspective. I think a stronger sense of the horizon line and making sure you understand that fully would really help. I'd almost like to see maybe have it go this way. Mess with your composition too much. Make sure you get that perspective in there. Make sure this mountain back here reads correctly. And then I'd like to see a few spots where, again, just like up here, you have this bright contrast of these crashing waves on the coast. Make sure you get that full value range. And I think just makes this piece pop a lot more. And then same goes for that kind of warm glow. I think will look pretty cool. That nice warm orangey glow that this piece is all about. This nice sea spray side. Yeah, just very, very tiny tweak, but just enough to get it closer to what you're studying there and why that original piece just pops and why there's a really intense intensity to it. Maybe a bit more attention to the greens that are up here. I think they're getting a little too dull, and part of what I like about this is that there are some pretty strong green tones in here. It's nice yellowy green. Cool to see. You can back in some of that. Or the value difference between the light and dark back here is very tight, but it's that color difference that is providing the form. Yeah, overall, really nice. Looking good. Right, let's see here. So we've got a number of value studies, color studies, and applied studies. Take a quick look at these. All right, the value and color studies look good. I think what I'm seeing here, what I think the problem is that when you're doing applied studies, you're tending towards flattening things. Because I'm looking at the pieces you're showing here, and they all have very, very strong senses of depth and perspective. And then you're sort of smooshing them as you do your applied studies. You're sort of falling back into your own comfort zone rather than utilizing what is really strong about these. Like if you look at this piece has a very strong sense of perspective. And it's not actually just because the figures are there. If the figures weren't there, you would still have a strong sense of perspective because all of these rocks and forms are adhering to perspective. Whereas when you're doing your own piece here, I don't have any sense of perspective. It just does not read nearly as clearly. So I'd like to see stronger indications of the form, that you're really looking up at this stuff at the top and you're really looking out at this stuff at the bottom and almost flattening out some of the stuff you've got here. So all the time. Furthermore, you're sort of taking this nice overlapping sense that he's got here and again, sort of smooshing it out into what you're used to. Um, he's got some great sense of this overlapping rocks and stuff that is very subtle and really quite beautiful. And I think you're missing out on that as you go back to what you're used to. This composition is fantastic and has all this great depth and perspective. And then you're sort of flattening it out. You're putting it into the foreground, and then you're painting a background, and there's no interplay between those two. There's no sense of, what would happen if you actually really integrated these and had one of these really going back and took the time to look at the perspective and have some of these things actually going back into the form, into the landscape. So I think that's actually what's really appealing about the original is the sense of perspective. And it's the one part that you sort of haven't studied. I think you tend to rely too much on the compositions you already know and don't utilize the opportunity to try these new compositions. So already that's starting to get a bit more interest in there. And same goes here. You've sort of muddled up the values in your piece where they're all sort of samey, whereas this is very clear about shadows and lights and making sure that these forms, even as simple as they are with these subtle indications, you can very clearly tell exactly what shape these are. Whereas as you're getting into your applied study, I can't tell what shape any of these are. And part of that does come down to the edge work. You've got a lot of kind of these overly crisp edges that are just sort of slapped on there with the lasso tool. And then you haven't gone in there to really carefully analyze, where is this sitting in perspective and how can I show off the fact that, this shadow would be casting on this thing and this form is going to go back behind it. And you haven't shown us that, which is why all of these little indications are kind of flattening out in your piece. So that's sort of the general idea that I'm getting with all of these, is they're all sort of smashing together into a pancake. And you're trying to take the stuff you're learning in the studies and kind of, as soon as you start applying it, falling back on your usual routines. So just a few things to think about going forward with your studies. All right, this looks good. Really nice work with observing the colors. I really like the nice subtle color and value stuff that you're seeing in here. This is another case where the artist is very good about selectively using the extreme darks. And I think you've gotten a lot of them in here. And there's a few, obviously, that you've missed. A few punches of really, really dark darks that is helping the whole piece read. And these little, single brushstrokes of dark, believe it or not, are incredibly important. Those very simple edges say so much. And it's a nice way of getting this muted color scheme to work nicely. And then I think when you went into your own, you've gotten a lot of a good color into this. I think you're missing out on the contrast, though, on the fact that this actually is fairly contrasty. At least in a couple of places, you've got some areas of strong contrast and strong light. I'd also encourage you to try to get in some of the perspective stuff that's happening here. He's doing a very good job of focusing in the perspective of making sure that we are, getting a very strong sense of looking up at, the upper portions, looking down at the down portions, and even in these loose rocks with these very loose scribbles, he's saying so much. And so if there are ways that you can show, whether it's with these tree branches and stuff, that where the forms are wrapping around, something that's worth analyzing about this piece. Show us the top planes, show us where things are wrapping around, really get that sense of perspective for us. Same goes for the ground. Let's really see that we're looking down at this stuff and this stuff is wrapping around. As much of that sense of form as you can possibly squeeze out of it. So, just a little bit more pop in there. This piece really, really pops, and it's got a strong sense of light and perspective in it. So just some thoughts. But overall, just really nicely done. Don't forget about a few more dark spots here and there. And also, he does have a few more saturated spots. So even though it's a very muted piece overall, there are a couple spots in here, especially up here, where the greens actually get quite a lot more saturated. And again, that's kind of like what we do with the values of if you've got a few hits of really dark darks or really bright brights, it makes the rest of this muted piece work nicely. Same goes for color. If you've got a few really saturated spots, and it will help an overall very desaturated piece kind of work a little bit stronger. It gives us more context that it's fully fleshed out in terms of color. All right, it's looking great. Just take a quick look at all these. So we've got the original, the value color, the color study, and the applied study. Yeah, these are looking really, really good. Really like what you're doing here. Got some very strong colors, got some good forms, got some really good compositions too. I'm really impressed with some of your applied studies. In fact, I sort of mistook them as master studies to begin with. So it's a good sign. Like this in particular is super successful. You've done a great job of translating the whole feel of this into an applied study. Not only does it have the right colors and stuff, but you've even gotten the sense of depth and size to it, everything. Like this mountain in the background feels big just based on the perspective you started to put in there. It works really, really well. Same goes for this bottom one here. Really like what you've done there. You've done a great job of taking out the parts that you really like about this original and putting it into a piece. The only thing I'd say on that one is I do like contrast that the snow gets on that one. And I think you're missing out on it a little bit by sort of having the rock and the snow value to be too much the same. I think there should be a few areas where the snow is being hit by the light and is a different value than the rock being hit by the light. And I think that's something that could make this piece a bit stronger. I think for this one, something that you're missing out on is the strong sense of perspective on the ground plane. You know, this piece it's trying to use this indication of these shadows here to show the ground plane going back there, as well as those tracks back there, whereas this is kind of flattening out. So do what you can with this little bit of edge treatment here to show us this perspective. So, you know, if you've got water hitting the shoreline here, do what you can to show this, you know, this dark area really receding back here so that we get some stronger depth on the ground. Even probably flatten that out a bit more. Those little areas of overlap are where we get all sense of perspective on a simple piece like this. Same goes for this. I think you could actually flatten out a few of the areas to get stronger depth, which is going to make those mountains appear much larger. Some little things with the perspective. Because look a little further away, a little bigger, a little more intimidating. I also wonder about some of the shapes of the shadows here that I think you're missing out on here, that you're overly simplifying the rock shapes. And I really like the original and these like shadow shapes for this stuff, because it shows us so much about the fact that, you know, these are going down into this. This is another layer. This is, you know, being cast onto this. This mountain here is casting a shadow on into this hillside here. And then there's another one coming out. And there's so much being indicated by this one shadow shape, which you've done a good job of observing. And then you haven't really taken the time to show us that in here. Whereas you could really take your time and, you know, create a shadow shape that does similar things here. It starts to get that nice layering effect. I wonder if some of the bright values are getting a bit too bright in there. Obviously a bit stylized here, but feeling that you're just getting a little too bright in there in the mid-ground to some degree. But overall, just really nice stuff. Really like what you've done with the applied studies there. Yeah, fantastic work. All right, and we've got, this is the last one. So if you guys have any questions while I'm taking care of this one, I can get to those questions after we're done. So just so you know. This looks really good. You've done a really nice job with the study, and good job of translating it into the final. I think the thing that I'm seeing here that I'd like to see you focus on a little more is the original's ability to have a tighter value range in portraying the lights and darks. Because I think one of the strengths of this piece is the fact that the shadows here are almost the same value as these lights. And it's just these subtle indications. And you're observing it pretty well here. I almost wonder if you could get a little bit brighter blue in some of these areas. But I think you're missing out on it a bit here, and going back to what you think the contrast should be, and being a little more scared of doing these very, very subtle contrasts. And I'd like to see maybe a bit more of this brought into this, whether that means you know, bringing your value ranges on these mountains a little bit tighter together, or what. I also see that rather than tightly observing the shapes of the shadows being cast, you're sort of implying a few random ones and hoping that kind of does the trick. Whereas it kind of doesn't. You know, we need to have some indication of why there's a certain shadow here, whether that means that you need to show us some more trees here that would be casting shadows onto this, or what exactly. Making sure that those shadow shapes are making a bit more sense, or simplifying things out so that you really don't have those shapes. That would also be fine. For instance, you could go a bit more like this. And maybe you do have, you know, shadow being cast from this one here. Maybe some larger, clearer shapes. Show us how those things work. Show us those forms, rather than relying on kind of a bit looser, brushier effects. And if you can get by with showing us the same thing in very clear forms for now, I think you'd probably be a little bit better off than trying to use too much brushwork. Kind of bring these values up a bit brighter to show what I was talking about with those stylization that the original has with bringing the values of the lights and darks very close together. I think works really nicely. Using more color contrast than value contrast. It's a bit of a stylistic choice, but it's something that I do like about the original, and I'd like to see, you know, if you don't tend to use it in your own work, that's fine, but I think it's at least worth studying. So you've got this sort of trick in your arsenal so that, you know, there might be times when you do want to do more color contrasting depictions of light than necessarily value translating, because it's sort of a standard thing for us to get used to using value transitions instead of the color transitions. So maybe pay a little bit more attention to that. But overall, really nicely done and really a nicely observed study. Yeah, I think that brings us to the end. I think that's all of them. So fantastic work overall. You guys did great stuff. I really like this week. It's a great week for doing studies. People tend to learn quite a lot by doing them, and I think you guys have done really good. So overall, everybody kind of needs to work on form and perspective because that's what people tend to need to do. Yeah, overall, it's really nice. Proud of you guys. We will be back, I believe, on the 10th or 11th. I'm going to take a little bit of a long time here on week 3 through, and as well as if you want to do some more week 2 stuff, you guys have plenty of time to do that. So great work. If you have more questions, I'll try to take a look in the Discord. And yeah, awesome work. And I will talk to you guys in a couple weeks. Yay. And we're out of here.